Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthology, written and narrated by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robbins. The Terror from Across Time. My story begins in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert, 85 kilometers northwest of the capital city, Riyadh. My team had set up our base at the entrance of a recently discovered ancient tomb. It was so old that it didn't even have a name or a story about it. Satellites had pinpointed its location while searching for gravitational anomalies on the Earth's surface as part of a project to measure the planet's magnetosphere. Our team had only recently located the site and dug out the entrance. The chambers within were empty, and they'd long since been looted. Nothing remained inside except strange carvings, drawings, and symbols on the walls that didn't match any known culture or civilization in the region. Their age was unknown since we hadn't even found anything that could be carbon dated. When the Saudi government found the site to be empty, they had no interest, but they had nevertheless posted several squads of army soldiers to protect the place in case anything of value was eventually found. While our respective nations were ostensibly allies, they did not trust each other very much. Apparently, they considered the place a blasphemous pagan site and forbid any of their own people from entering it. However, they didn't object to our presence there, since we were already considered to be unclean infidels who were long past any hope of salvation. Our team had set up a large tent at the entrance to the vault-like ruin. It had taken days to thoroughly photograph and analyze the inscriptions within. However, all attempts to translate the writing failed. Still, there were odd similarities to other ancient archaeological sites around the world. It then took 2 more weeks to have generators and heavy equipment we required to complete our studies installed. Sensitive monitors confirmed the presence of a gravitational anomaly, and detailed measurements suggested that not only gravity but space itself was affected. Distances near the center of the crypt were not uniform or consistent, and sensitive chronometers indicated that time near that invisible nexus did not flow at the same rate as it did further away. No one knew for certain why, but I had my own theories. As days passed, I grew anxious to begin our field trials of experiments that I had designed to study the anomaly. But I waited impatiently for the last of our crew to assemble. Then, early one morning, our final team member arrived. An older man, nearly twice my age, hurried into the tent, panting and complaining about the heat outside. As he took off his hat and fanned himself with it, he extended his other hand and said, "Professor Veckman, it's a pleasure to finally be here. I hope, however, that your discovery is worth the trip. I'm a bit old for this type of adventure." "Thank you, Dr. Niedermeyer," I replied. Please have a seat and cool off a bit." Then I gestured for one of my technicians to bring the doctor a plastic bottle of water. Then I fetched a stack of notes and handed them to my new guest. Barely giving him time to catch his breath, I showed him the strange inscriptions that covered the walls around him. He studied them closely, and then he looked up and exclaimed, "This is amazing! These symbols and characters are identical to those I found at Gunung Pagang in Indonesia, and that site dates back to the end of the last ice age, nearly 20,000 years ago. How old did you say this is?" "We haven't been able to date it precisely," I said, "but from the stonework, we estimate it's no more than 3,500 years old." "But that's impossible," he said. "Those glyphs are far too old to show up here. There's no way they could have endured unchanged across so many millennia. Perhaps the glyphs and symbols were simply copied from other sources. But how is that possible? I asked. Gungun Padang is on the other side of the Indian Ocean, more than 7,000 kilometers away. Now excited, the doctor asked, have you found anything that might help in the translation of this language? No, I said. I'm sorry. There's no evidence of any contemporary languages in this site, nothing that we could find that would help us decipher what they mean. Niedermeyer looked disappointed. So I moved to the next important piece of information that I thought might interest him. Here, look at this, I said, showing him more writing and drawing that we had discovered. Tell me what you think of these. Well, said the doctor, these look familiar, but I can't recall where I've seen them before. These, I said, are identical to the illustrations from the books of an early 20th century author named H.P. Lovecraft. Studying them briefly, he looked and said, You've got to be kidding me. You're saying some writer of pulp horror stories published these same hieroglyphics a century ago? I hate to say it, but yes, I replied. Niedermeyer started to speak, but stammered instead, finding it difficult to say anything intelligible in response. I'm as surprised as you are, I confess. Perhaps he came across old manuscripts or writings. Such ancient texts may have actually been the source of his stories. If that's the case, the stories he wrote may have been based on myths far older than we've imagined, perhaps even older than your discoveries in Indonesia. Niedermeyer threw the notes on the floor. This is hogwash. Your site must have been compromised by vandals before you got here. I don't believe a word of what you're telling me. Nodding, I reached over and retrieved data records from the technical measurements that we'd been taking all week. You may deny all that you want, I said, but you can't ignore this. Glancing at the printouts, the doctor looked up and said, I don't understand what any of this says. What do these numbers mean? Turning to the center of the vault, I pointed at 4 short black pillars that stood in a square in the middle of the room. See that? Inside those stone obelisks is a spatial and temporal anomaly unlike anything we've ever found before. But I don't see anything there, said the doctor. No, I replied, we can't see it, but we can measure it. It's a region of space that's warped and twisted somehow. Distances near it aren't linear. Time near it flows slower than it does further away. Gravity is distorted, and there's nothing that explains it except perhaps a small tear in the fabric of space-time itself. The doctor paused and then nodded. All right, I can see where this is going, Veckman. I thought you'd long since given up your outlandish theories about ancient gods and time travel. Once again, you're sounding like those pseudoscientists that sell conspiracy theories on the internet, or fantasy authors that write pulp fiction. But it's the only thing that makes sense, I insisted. The evidence has been around us forever, but it's been ignored by scientists around the world because it's impossible to explain. Ancient beings that lived far in the past have been reaching out to us through time portals like this one, with the intention of reestablishing themselves in our world. Dozens of sites like this have been uncovered, but no one ever takes them seriously. There are stories of the cult of Dagon from the eastern Mediterranean nearly 4,000 years ago, and the stories of H.P. Lovecraft and the godlike Cthulhu are based on similar events over the centuries. Pointing at the center of the room, I said, This spatial anomaly is all the proof I need. Just withhold your judgment until I perform a few experiments. Then I stopped and pointed at equipment that had been placed around the obelisks. These are superconducting magnets, I said. They're capable of generating magnetic fields that are far stronger than anything on Earth. I'm going to activate them and measure the effects on this anomaly. If I'm right, I'll be able to prove that this was once a portal that was used to travel here from the ancient past. Wait, said Niedermeyer. You mean you intend to open a portal to a place you think monsters reside? No, of course not, I replied. That would take far more power than we could ever produce here. I just want to find out how much we can affect the node. And if we're lucky, maybe we can peek to wherever or whenever it's connected to. I motioned the technicians to fire up the generators, and a large humming sound filled the room. For the longest time, nothing happened. But then the air in the center of the pylons wavered like the shimmering you might see over a hot asphalt road in the summer sun. Then a small sphere of light slowly started to glow above the ground in the center of the obelisks. Before I could say anything, there was a flash of light and a loud popping sound behind me. I turned to find a short little man in a silver suit, standing a few feet away. He carried a heavy bag on one shoulder and an odd-looking device in his other hand. His eyes were covered by goggles, not sunglasses, but rather the kind of eye protectors that a swimmer might wear. I blinked in disbelief as the stranger stepped to one side and said, "Gral itak rufakida?" When I didn't respond, he touched a medallion on his chest and spoke again. "Matwana Adam Rabushna?" Then he tapped the medallion around his neck once more and said, "Can you hear me now?" I nodded silently. "Sorry, it sometimes takes me a while to adjust my translator to the appropriate era." Who are you?" I stammered. "Oh, you can call me Nemad, but don't mind me, I'm only passing through." Then one of the technicians, holding a measurement device, who stood closest to the little fellow, said, "Professor, this guy's radiating temporal energy like nothing I've ever measured. It's off the scale." Turning back to the unexpected visitor, I said, "You're a time traveler, aren't you?" "Well, actually, yes, I am," he said. Then he looked around and studied the people and equipment nearby. "Wow, this is really quite unexpected. I wasn't aware that anyone from your species in this time period knew anything about temporal mechanics. Wow, this is all very unprecedented." "You're not human?" I asked. "Oh, no," said the strange little man. "I'm from a race called the Ita." What are you doing here?" The little man gestured at the glowing sphere floating between the stone obelisks. I then noted that it had grown in size. "Oh, I'm just here to monitor things." "Well, that specifically," he said, pointing at the anomaly, "along with what happens later. However, I didn't expect anyone to be here." "Wait, can you tell me what this is?" I asked. The little man smiled. "Why, it's what you've already guessed. It's a temporal rift, and when I detected it, I came to record it. These types of things don't happen very often. They usually occur randomly, though I can see this one has been opened before. They're usually quite rare and typically only occur once or twice a millennium." "Okay, I think I understand," I said. "Please listen and tell me if I'm right. I believe this rift once opened to the ancient past. By my calculations, it would be more like 1,000,000 years ago. If legends are correct, it was created by a race of godlike beings that enslaved the human race long ago, maybe many ice ages ago. Anyway, they ruled the earth for thousands of years, but these monstrous beings are trying to break through into our time to conquer us all again. Am I right?" The little man tilted his head and replied, That's really amazing. You're quite close, but you're way off at the same time. You see, there is indeed an era controlled by very powerful, unholy beings like you suggest, and they've enslaved the human race, or at least a sizable portion of it. And they are, in fact, responsible for creating these portals so they can reach through time. But you've got a lot of your facts wrong. First of all, these beings don't exist in the past. They exist in your future, very far in the future, about 2 million years. Like you said. What? I gasped. Okay, let me explain. About 50,000 years from now, mankind, your race, will venture out into space and build a vast galactic empire with Earth as its capital. That's when humans will meet our race, the Eta, along with several other intelligent species. But then things will go wrong. After most of humanity had fled to the stars, several very powerful machine intelligences decided to take over everything. And there was a very brief but very nasty war. In the future, after that war, the Terran Empire would have to isolate this planet and trap those beings here. Don't ask me how they did it. I don't know enough about astrophysics and multidimensional manifolds to explain. But who are you, then? I asked. You're not human. No, replied the strange little man. I'm from a race that your species will meet out in the stars, and we have technologies that your race doesn't. Our species alone possesses the secret to time travel. But we just watch and monitor things. Think of us as temporal explorers. We don't change anything. We're like historians and journalists. Anyway, after those alien machine intelligences became trapped on this planet, they grew larger and more powerful. Eventually, however, they grew tired of being bound in machine form, since those technologies are hard to maintain. Therefore, they opted to transfer themselves into organic bodies. After all, organic beings are more adaptable, and they heal themselves. Also, they're more efficient at generating energy from a wider variety of forms, particularly anything organic, plants and animals, and even oil or coal. In organic forms, these beings found they could change their shape to anything they wanted. One of the old ones turned into a giant with a squid-like face. Another just became a shapeless, gelatinous blob the size of one of those pyramids. A third shaped itself to become an enormous giant eye surrounded by countless tentacles. In total, there are about a dozen of those godlike intelligences. Unfortunately, they eventually started running out of food. So they started breeding their human slaves for food. The problem is that over time, the breeding stock gets too inbred. So periodically they reach back in time to gather new gene stock to replenish their herds of humans for food. So basically, you're right. There is a race of dark gods that's enslaved your race, but they're in your distant future, not your prehistoric past. Also, they do periodically open these time portals, but they don't do so to take over. Rather, they just reach through to harvest people to use as food stock. But their use of temporal anomalies is quite limited. You see, the secret of time travel is something that the Eta alone control. No other race is allowed to have that technology. No other race is even allowed to know about our ability to travel through time. That's why we study these temporal ruptures. The old ones can apparently open portals in time without advanced technology, but we don't understand how they do it. In any case, they're too big to pass through and remain trapped on Earth in the far future. So it doesn't matter that much. This situation, however, is a bit unique. You see, your equipment is primitive and could never open such a temporal rift, but your tampering has somehow weakened local space-time and attracted the attention of those very beings that I've been telling you about. In a very short while, this nexus is going to rupture, and you're going to find out firsthand what a chthonic incursion looks like. I stood in shock. Glancing at Dr. Niedermeyer, I found him also awestruck. Then the alien said, "Hey, I'd love to chat, but I really need to be going." Reaching into his shoulder bag, he pulled out about a dozen silver discs, about the size of a baseball, and then scattered them on the ground. When they landed, each one sprouted a set of legs and skittered around before vanishing out of sight. "These mobile units," said the little man, "will record what's going to happen here. I'll come back and pick them up in a few decades, but I really have to leave before things get a little too frenetic here." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that your little experiment here has opened," what did the translator call it? "A Pandora's box of trouble." Studying a readout on the device he held, Nimad said, "By my records, this will be the largest infestation in more than 2,000 years, and it will last more than a quarter century before it's successfully closed." "You mean the whole world's going to be conquered by these creatures?" "Well, the future records of the Terran Empire are a bit spotty about this particular time period, but I think it remained a relatively localized event. My notes indicate an area about 500 or 600 miles across will be completely overrun, and more than 30,000 humans will eventually be harvested. Apparently, it'll take a while before the invading creatures are completely eradicated. You see, once they get settled, the minions that come through are quite difficult to remove." "Wait," I shouted. "If you don't allow others to know about your race and time travel, then why did you tell us?" "Well," he said, "because it doesn't matter. Normally I'd have to kill you all to eliminate any possible witnesses, but in this case I'll be spared those unpleasantries. You see, in a few moments that nexus is going to break wide open and release a psychic blast that'll kill everyone nearby." As the alien manipulated dials on his device, a long black tentacle reached slowly through the expanding disc in the middle of the room. At first I thought it was growing, but then I realized it was just a very large tentacle that was reaching further and further through the rift. It waved around for a moment and then touched one of the nearby generators. It wrapped around one of them, and the equipment erupted in a shower of sparks. "Ah, that would be Shub-Niggurath," said Nimad, "the dark one with one eye and lots of slimy arms. Well, it was nice meeting you, but I've got to go." And then he disappeared with a loud pop. Dr. Niedermeyer stood up and shouted, What should we do now?" "Run," I shouted back. People ran toward the exit, but someone ran into one of the tent poles, knocking it down, and the canvas roof half collapsed, blocking the exit. I reached down to grab my notes and turned to run, but I was suddenly blocked by a door that appeared in front of me. I mean, an actual door. It just floated in the air in front of me. It looked like a metal hatch that you might find on a naval ship or a submarine, and it hovered a couple feet above the ground. Before I could react, the hatch opened and revealed two people standing in the doorway. One, a young girl in her late teens, held the door open as an older man leaned out and extended his arm toward me. "Quickly," he shouted, "take my hand. I haven't time to explain." I reached for his arm and then paused because he seemed familiar. Then I realized what it was. It was my own face. You know, like you might see in one of those filters on your smartphone that make you look older. Glancing up, I stared into the face that I saw in the mirror every morning. The eyes drooped a little, and the skin was wrinkled, especially around the eyes, and his hair was white, but it was me. I opened my mouth to speak, but he interrupted, saying, "Yes, I'm you. We'll have time to talk about it later. We don't have time now. We had to wait until the Eta left. They mustn't know that humans in the future possess time ships like this one. But hurry, take my hand. There's a lot you need to know and people you need to meet, but we need to hurry." A loud growling sound erupted from the glowing portal, and the girl screamed, "Dad, they're here!" "Dad?" I thought, blinking. Then my older self grabbed my arm and yanked me through the doorway. As the door closed, it disappeared from view as the ship slipped into the time stream. Then the temporal rift ruptured. Later, I found out that when the portal burst, it sent out a wave of energy that killed everyone within a 5-kilometer radius. Dr. Niedermeyer, my co-workers, even all the Saudi guards. Immediately thereafter, monsters streamed out of the gate, black, scaly things with long, fang-like teeth and razor-sharp claws. They hungrily crawled all over one another and hurriedly scampered out of the exit as they raced across the desert sands outside in search of food for their ravenous masters. And that's how my adventures traveling through time began. Of course, what happened next is a different story. Thank you for listening. As you know by now, we love our listeners, fans, patrons, and supporters. Please let us know what you think of our podcast and our stories. The best way to do that is to subscribe to our podcast at untold-tales.com. By doing so, you'll be added to our mailing list so you can be notified of upcoming episodes, blogs, and other information. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.